The clerk at the consulate in Nogales didn't look up when Mateo slid the photocopy of his birth certificate across the counter. She just sighed, pushed it back, and said the system showed no record of him. How do you prove you exist when the country you were born in says you don't?
The air in Nogales, Sonora, tasted like dust and diesel. Mateo stood outside the U.S. consulate, staring at the building he'd visited 4 times in 3 weeks. Each time, the answer was the same: insufficient documentation. Each time, he left with empty hands and a lighter wallet. He folded the photocopy of his birth certificate, creased now, softened by sweat and handling, and tucked it back into his shirt pocket. The original was somewhere in a Phoenix storage unit he couldn't access. His wallet, his social security card, his driver's license, all locked behind a border he couldn't cross. 3 months ago, Mateo had been living in Tempe, driving a forklift at a beverage distribution center, splitting rent with his cousin Danny. He worked early shifts, ate breakfast burritos from the truck on McDowell Road, and sent money to his tia in Tucson every other week. His life wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Then the audit happened. Immigration and Customs Enforcement swept the warehouse on a Tuesday morning. Mateo had handed over his driver's license, confident. He was born in Yuma. He'd never left the country except for a high school trip to Rocky Point. But somewhere in the system, his name had been flagged. Mateo Aranda, 29, no record of citizenship. The agent who processed him didn't listen when Mateo explained about his birth certificate, about his mother's maiden name on the hospital records, about the fact that he'd voted in the last election. The man just kept typing, kept shaking his head. Detained, transferred, deported. It all happened in 72 hours. Now Mateo rented a narrow room above a panaderia in Nogales, Sonora, and worked unloading trucks at a furniture warehouse for cash. The owner, a man named Esteban, didn't ask questions. Mateo didn't offer answers. He kept his head down, saved what he could, and returned to the consulate every week. The photocopied birth certificate was all he had. Danny had found it in Mateo's bedroom, tucked inside an old notebook, and mailed it south. But a photocopy wasn't enough. The consulate needed originals. They needed proof he was who he said he was. Mateo walked back toward the crossing, watching families funnel through the pedestrian lanes. Vendors sold elote and tacos de carne asada from carts. A woman with a baby on her hip haggled over the price of a phone charger. The smell of grilled onions mixed with exhaust. He'd tried calling his tia. She was elderly, living on disability, and didn't understand how he'd ended up on the wrong side of the border. She kept saying she'd pray for him, that God would fix it. Mateo didn't have the heart to tell her prayer wasn't going to get him past a consulate clerk. Danny had tried to help. He'd gone to the storage unit, but the manager wouldn't let him in without Mateo's ID. Danny had called a lawyer, but the retainer was $3,000, money neither of them had. Eventually, Danny stopped answering Mateo's calls. Mateo didn't blame him. What could his cousin do? Back in his room above the panaderia, Mateo sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled out a notebook. He'd started keeping a list: people to contact, documents to request, steps to take. The list had grown long. Most of the items were crossed out. He flipped to a blank page and wrote the date. Below it, he wrote, "Consulate. Denied again. Need original birth certificate. Need lawyer. Need $3,000. He stared at the words until they blurred. The next morning, Mateo was back at the furniture warehouse. Esteban handed him a work order and a bottle of water. "You look tired, mijo," the older man said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. But you work hard. That's something." Mateo spent the day hauling armoires and bed frames, his muscles burning, his mind elsewhere. He thought about his apartment in Tempe, about the life he'd built. He thought about the clerk at the consulate, her bored expression, the way she'd barely glanced at his photocopy. He thought about his mother. She died when he was 12. Cancer, fast and brutal. His father had left before Mateo could remember him. His tia had taken him in, raised him in Tucson, made sure he graduated high school. She used to say he had her stubbornness, her refusal to quit. Mateo wasn't sure he believed that anymore. That evening, he walked to a small cafe near the border crossing. It was a place he'd started visiting mostly because it had free Wi-Fi, and the owner didn't mind if he nursed a single coffee for hours. He opened his laptop, another thing Danny had mailed south, and searched for legal aid organizations, for advocacy groups, for anyone who might help. Most of the websites led to dead ends. The phone numbers went to voicemail. The email addresses bounced back. He was about to close the laptop when a woman at the next table leaned over. She was older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled into a bun and sharp, thoughtful eyes. "You're looking for help with immigration?" she asked in English, her accent crisp and clear. "Yeah, sort of. I volunteered with a legal clinic on the other side. We help people navigate the system." She handed him a business card. "Come by on Thursday. We do walk-ins from 2 to 5. Mateo took the card, studying it. The address was in Nogales, Arizona. "I can't cross," he said quietly. The woman's expression softened. "You're stuck here." He nodded. She thought for a moment, then pulled out a pen and wrote a phone number on the back of the card. "Call this number. Ask for Elena. She's a paralegal. She'll know what to do." Mateo stared at the card, something tightening in his chest. "Why are you helping me?" The woman smiled. "Because someone helped me once. Pass it on when you can." She stood, gathered her things, and walked out into the warm evening. Mateo sat there, the card in his hand, the first spark of hope he'd felt in weeks. Mateo called the number the next morning. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice brisk but kind. "This is Elena." He explained his situation in halting sentences: the deportation, the photocopy, the consulate's refusal. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked, "Do you have anyone in the U.S. who can request your birth certificate from Yuma County?" "My cousin, maybe, but he's been hard to reach." "Try him again. If he can get the original and bring it to the consulate, that's your best shot. In the meantime, I'll see if we can file an appeal with ICE. It's a long process, but it's something." Mateo felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly. "How much does this cost?" "For you? Nothing. We're a nonprofit." He almost didn't believe her. "Why?" Elena paused. "Because what happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. Let me do my job." That night, Mateo called Danny again. This time, his cousin picked up. "Mateo, man, I'm sorry I haven't called back. Work's been crazy and I need your help, Mateo. I need you to go to Yuma and get my birth certificate, the original. I'll pay you back, I swear." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Yuma's 4 hours away." "I know." Another pause. Then, "Okay, I'll go this weekend." Mateo closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "Thank you." The next few days passed in a blur of work and waiting. Mateo hauled furniture, ate cheap tortas from a street vendor, and checked his phone obsessively for updates from Danny. Elena called once to say she'd started the paperwork for an appeal, but warned him it could take months. On Saturday, Danny sent a photo, the original birth certificate sealed in a plastic sleeve, lying on the seat of his truck. Mateo stared at the image, his throat tight. "I'm driving down tomorrow. I'll meet you at the consulate," Danny texted. Sunday morning, Mateo stood outside the consulate an hour before it opened. The sun was already hot, the sky a hard, cloudless blue. He watched cars line up at the crossing, watched pedestrians shuffle through the turnstiles. Danny appeared just after 9, crossing on foot with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked older than Mateo remembered, thinner with new lines around his eyes. "You okay?" Danny asked, gripping Mateo's shoulder. Mateo nodded, not trusting his voice. Inside the consulate, they waited for 2 hours. When Mateo's number was finally called, he handed the clerk the original birth certificate, his hands shaking. She scanned it, typed something, scanned it again. Then she frowned. "There's a hold on your file. You'll need to resolve that before we can process this." Mateo's stomach dropped. "What kind of hold?" "I can't tell you. You'll need to contact ICE directly." "But I have my birth certificate. I'm a U.S. citizen." The clerk's expression didn't change. "I understand, but there's a hold. I can't override it." Danny stepped forward. "This is insane, Mateo. He was born in Arizona. He's been paying taxes his whole life. You can't just—" "Sir, I don't make the rules." Mateo pulled Danny back. "It's okay. Let's go." Outside, Danny kicked at the sidewalk, furious. "This is bullshit, Mateo. They can't do this to you." Mateo leaned against the building, staring at the sky. "They already did." They sat in the shade of a mesquite tree, passing a bottle of water back and forth. Danny kept apologizing, kept saying he should have done more. Mateo told him it wasn't his fault. "I'll keep trying, Danny. I'll call the lawyer again. Maybe we can scrape together the retainer." Mateo didn't answer. He was tired of trying, tired of waiting, tired of hoping. That evening, after Danny crossed back north, Mateo walked to the cafe where he'd met the woman with the business card. He didn't know why. Maybe he just needed to sit somewhere that felt less suffocating. Elena called while he was staring at his cold coffee. "I heard about the hold," she said. "I'm sorry. But I found something. There's a judge in Tucson, retired now, but he still does pro bono consultations. He specializes in wrongful deportation cases. I sent him your file. He wants to talk to you." Mateo straightened. "When?" "Tomorrow if you're available. He'll call you at noon." Mateo wrote down the details, his hand steadier than it had been in weeks. "Elena, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just answer the phone tomorrow."
Judge Harold Brennan called at noon exactly. His voice was deep and measured, with the kind of authority that made you sit up straighter even over the phone. "Mr. Aranda, I've reviewed your case. What happened to you is a bureaucratic nightmare, but it's not insurmountable. The hold on your file is likely a data matching error, someone with a similar name or social security number flagged in the system. We need to file a formal challenge with ICE and request a hearing." Mateo gripped the phone tighter. "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe longer. But in the meantime, I can coach you through gathering evidence. School records, employment history, tax returns, anything that proves continuous residence in the U.S. Do you have access to any of that?" "Some of it. My cousin might be able to get the rest." "Good. Start there. And Mr. Aranda, don't give up. You have a case." Over the next 2 weeks, Mateo became a detective of his own life. Danny mailed him old report cards, a baptism certificate from a church in Tucson, and a stack of W-2 forms. Mateo's tia sent a notarized letter attesting to his upbringing. Elena filed motions, sent emails, and navigated bureaucratic mazes with the kind of dogged persistence Mateo wished he still had. At the warehouse, Esteban noticed the change in him. "You've got fight in your eyes again," the older man said one afternoon. Mateo shrugged. "I'm trying. That's all any of us can do." The legal process crept forward. Judge Brennan submitted a formal challenge to ICE. Elena sent follow-up requests to the consulate. Mateo waited, the days blurring together. One evening, he returned to the cafe and found the woman who'd given him Elena's number sitting at the same table. She smiled when she saw him. "Any progress?" she asked. Mateo nodded. "Some. It's slow, but it's something." "Slow is better than nothing." They talked for a while, about the border, about bureaucracy, about the strange kindness of strangers. The woman's name was Margaret. She'd crossed the border illegally as a teenager decades ago and spent years fighting for legal status. Now she volunteered to help others navigate the same system. "You'll get through this," she said. "It won't feel like it some days, but you will." Mateo wanted to believe her. Weeks turned into months. Mateo kept working, kept saving, kept gathering evidence. Danny visited twice more, each time bringing another piece of the puzzle. Judge Brennan called every few weeks with updates, small victories, minor setbacks. Then, in late spring, Elena called with news. ICE reviewed the challenge. They're lifting the hold. You can reapply at the consulate. Mateo felt his knees weaken. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. Go tomorrow." The next morning, Mateo stood outside the consulate again.
the original birth certificate in his hand. This time, the clerk processed it without issue. She handed him a receipt and said his passport would be ready in 2 weeks. Mateo walked out into the sunlight, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Relief, disbelief, hope. He called Danny first, then Elena, then Judge Brennan. Each of them congratulated him, their voices warm with shared victory. 2 weeks later, Mateo held his U.S. passport for the first time in 6 months. He stared at the photo, his face thinner, his eyes harder, and felt the weight of everything he'd lost and found. He crossed the border the next day.
The first thing Mateo noticed when he stepped into Arizona was the smell. It was the same desert air he'd grown up with, creosote and sun-baked earth, but it felt different now, foreign and familiar all at once. Danny picked him up at the crossing. They didn't say much on the drive to Tempe. Danny had cleaned out Mateo's old apartment and moved his things into storage. The distribution center had filled his position weeks ago. "You can stay with me," Danny said, "until you figure out what's next." Mateo nodded, staring out the window at the sprawl of Phoenix. Everything looked the same. He was the one who'd changed. He spent the first week applying for jobs. Most places wanted recent references, recent work history. Mateo had a gap he couldn't quite explain. "I was wrongfully deported" sounded like an excuse, even though it was the truth. He picked up shifts at a staffing agency. Warehouse work, loading docks, the kind of labor that didn't ask questions. The pay was less than before, but it was something. At night, he lay awake in Danny's spare room, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Nogales, about Esteban and Margaret and Elena. He thought about the months he'd spent on the wrong side of the border, invisible and powerless. He also thought about the people who'd helped him, the woman in the cafe who'd handed him a business card, the paralegal who'd worked for free, the retired judge who'd taken his case, the cousin who'd driven to Yuma on a Saturday. One afternoon, Mateo called Elena. "I'm back," he said. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Elena's voice was warm. "You don't owe me anything, Mateo, but I'm glad you're home." "Is there a way I can help? With the clinic, I mean? I don't have legal experience, but I could, I don't know, translate maybe? Or just be there for people who are going through what I went through." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We could use someone like you, someone who understands. Can you come down next Saturday?" Mateo smiled. "Yeah, I'll be there." The legal clinic in Nogales, Arizona was a small office tucked behind a community center. Elena introduced him to the team, 3 lawyers, 2 paralegals, and a handful of volunteers. They worked with asylum seekers, deportees, families separated by the border. Mateo started by translating intake forms. Then he began sitting in on consultations, listening to stories that echoed his own. People who'd been caught in bureaucratic snares, who'd lost everything, who were fighting to prove they belonged. He met a woman named Rosa, who'd been separated from her children for 2 years. He met a man named Julio, who'd been deported despite having a green card. He met a teenager named Carmen, who'd been brought to the U.S. as a baby and had no memory of Mexico. Each story broke something open in Mateo. Each story reminded him why he was there. Months passed. Mateo found a permanent job at a logistics company, working nights. He volunteered at the clinic on weekends. He called his tia every Sunday. He visited Marguerite at the cafe in Nogales, Sonora, crossing the border now with ease, with paperwork, with proof. One afternoon, Mateo called Elena. "I'm back," he said. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Elena's voice was warm. "You don't owe me anything, Mateo, but I'm glad you're home." "Is there a way I can help? With the clinic, I mean? I don't have legal experience, but I could, I don't know, translate maybe? Or just be there for people who are going through what I went through." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We could use someone like you, someone who understands. Can you come down next Saturday?" Mateo smiled. "Yeah, I'll be there."
A year after Mateo crossed back into Arizona, he stood outside the distribution center where he'd been detained. It looked smaller than he remembered. The loading docks,
the chain link fence, the parking lot where ICE agents had parked their vans. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe to prove to himself that it was real, that it had happened, that he'd survived it. Danny had offered to come with him, but Mateo had wanted to do this alone. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, watching trucks back into the bays. Then he turned and walked away. The legal clinic had grown. Elena had secured a grant, hired 2 more staff members, and opened a satellite office in Tucson. Mateo was there 3 days a week now, splitting his time between logistics work and the clinic. He'd started leading workshops, teaching people how to gather documents, how to navigate the consulate, how to advocate for themselves. He also kept a notebook. In it, he wrote the names of everyone he helped. Rosa, who'd been reunited with her children, Julio, whose green card had been restored, Carmen, who'd been granted deferred action. The list was growing. One evening, Mateo sat with Margaret at the cafe in Nogales, Sonora. She'd brought pan dulce, and they shared it over coffee. "You've done good work," she said. "You should be proud." Mateo shrugged. "I'm just doing what people did for me." Margaret smiled. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Someone helps you, you help someone else. The chain doesn't break." Mateo thought about that, about the woman who'd handed him a business card, about Elena and Judge Brennan and Danny and Esteban, about the hundreds of small kindnesses that had carried him through the worst months of his life. "I don't think I'd be here without all of you," he said quietly. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You'd be here. You're stubborn, but maybe it would have taken longer." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the border crossing in the distance, the lights, the lines, the endless flow of people moving between 2 worlds. Mateo's phone buzzed. A text from Elena. "New intake tomorrow. 19-year-old, wrongful deportation, no documents. Can you be there?" Mateo typed back, "I'll be there." He finished his coffee, said goodbye to Margaret, and walked back toward the crossing. The air was cool, the sky deepening to indigo. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A truck rumbled past. Mateo reached into his pocket and pulled out his passport. He ran his thumb over the embossed seal, the proof of who he was. It had taken 6 months, a retired judge, a volunteer paralegal, and a cousin who drove to Yuma on a Saturday. It had taken strangers who'd chosen kindness over indifference. He crossed the border, the agent waving him through without a second glance. On the other side, the lights of Nogales, Arizona glowed warm against the night. Mateo walked toward them, thinking about the young man he'd meet tomorrow, the one who'd be sitting in the clinic with a photocopy and a desperate hope. Mateo would sit across from him. He'd listen. He'd say, "We'll figure it out," because someone had said that to him once, and it had made all the difference.